There's been a lot happening in the last 5 years in Ontario, and I think that the early childhood world has changed pretty significantly. What we were curious about at the Atkinson Centre was, as kindergarten programs were being rolled out across the province, we were interested in knowing what kind of impact this would have on family life, what kind of impact it had on educators, school administration, and just school board policy. And it was a big move to get early childhood educators and teachers to be working together in an assumed partnership. So we wanted to see what was working and what wasn't working. So we looked at 3 Ontario regions, Ottawa, Waterloo, and Halton region, and 4 school boards, 3 public and 1 Catholic board. What we did was we did a bunch of things. We surveyed the parents, we surveyed educators, we did interviews with principals, with school administrators, with community leaders, and we did focus groups with parents and with educators. And what we wanted to do was, the research study has been going on for just over a year, and we really wanted this to be a collaborative research partnership, because we didn't want to do research just for the sake of going out there and exploring what happens and telling the story. We want the research to help to inform professional practice and also to potentially make some changes around policy. And what we learned from Ottawa was, before the rollout of full-day kindergarten and extended day programs, childcare was available in 28 schools, and now it's available in 80 out of 87 schools in the Waterloo community. Okay, so this is pretty significant for a school board that didn't actually have anything to do with providing before and after school care, summer programs, to now offering it. It also moved the number of spaces, and you can see that access went from 1,500 spaces to now about 4,000 spaces, with the addition of 53 new youth development programs. And what was interesting about the youth development programs is the school board recognized that this was an area of expertise that they didn't have, so they worked with Conestoga College with their ECE program and their child and youth program to actually create the curriculum for the before and after school summer programs for kids who are above the age of 8. And we thought that this was really interesting for a community to work closely with partners who did have expertise, rather than kind of carrying the ball on its own or saying, we don't want to do this, we're not going to stay in this business. Not yet. Yeah. In the Halton community, initially they had planned on rolling out the extended day programs themselves. Both the public and the Catholic boards were going to do that. But what happened in the first part of the rollout of full-day kindergarten was that the Ministry of Education created this fee structure that made it pretty untenable for the school boards to manage that, because the fee was pretty high for the parents. And what they were doing was they were expecting the school boards to charge a fee around kids with special needs, and it didn't matter how many kids you had. Okay, so the issue around kids with special needs continues to remain a challenge. So as a result of that, they decided in 2011 that they would contract out all of their programs. The Catholic School Board in Halton went with 1 provider, and the public school board has a number of providers. What we have seen here, is that the expansion of care has not been that significant, but there are 2 things that have stood out for us in this community. One is the fees in this area are very high, but the salaries are extremely low, right? And the other thing that we have come to learn is that they have a record number of programs operating completely without any early childhood educators on staff. In the next region we looked at was Ottawa-Carleton. So Ottawa-Carleton, you can see that initially had licensed childcare available in 44 schools, and now it has it available in 100 out of 117 schools. This is the public board only, and it's grown to offering up care to 6,000 kids. The interesting thing about Ottawa is that recently it has taken on the operation of preschool programs. So the school board actually operates infant, toddler, preschool programs. This is new, and it'll be very interesting to watch how that evolves. Now, in the Ottawa community, there was a long history of very decent work available in big multi-service nonprofit organizations where the staff were unionized. So in fact, the wage differential for early childhood educators coming from those jobs into school board jobs has not been all that significant. So as part of our study, we were curious about what parents thought about full-day kindergarten and extended day program, and we rolled out the survey only in the Waterloo School Board because that's the only community at that point that was able to process the parent survey. We wanted to make sure that the region and the school board were on board. All the other school boards were doing their own surveys. You can see, and this is so typical of any time you do any research with families, that mothers are predominantly the ones that respond to any requests. And, you know, we had some fathers involved, but not very many. The demographic was also pretty homogeneous, where most of them were married, most of them born in Canada, most parents speak English, and most of them, you know, close to 75% are working full-time. So this is the survey that went out through the school board. Try to remember that, and only about 130 parents responded. We also asked them questions about, you know, how they felt like full-day kindergarten and extended day has benefited their child, and most families would agree that, in fact, it does make a difference. Most families agree that the quality is pretty good at 75%, not fantastic, but pretty good. They agreed that full-day kindergarten helps gets their kid ready for school in terms of the social interactions and transitions into the higher grades, and then also helps their kids ready academically. We wanted to then, you know, think about some other issues. One of the things that comes to the forefront around anything related to school is how engaged our parents. The assumption was that by having kindergarten full day, that parents would be more involved. In fact, what our research shows us that it hasn't made much of a difference. And this was a good story for principals and school administrators to hear, because they were surprised and thought, okay, this is a bit of a challenge and we need to address what the issue was. And as we dug deeper, we found out some of the reasons why parents were not as involved. They were happy for full-day kindergarten to continue, but they also said that it doesn't really provide all that much support than it used to. Then, you know, there are other childcare or family resource type program experiences. What they would like to see is that more of those child and family services be offered through the school. So again, this is an issue that's hard for the early childhood sector to deal with, because some parents are saying to us that if I have to take my 4-year-old child to school, then I'd like to take my infant to a childcare center in the school as well. I don't want to have to go to University of Guelph childcare or the Y and then get my other kid back in the car and go up the road. And I think that if you think about it from a parent's perspective, that is not an unreasonable request. Okay, so wondering how we can kind of deal with some of these issues. This group of parents, interestingly enough, were more positive around their full-day kindergarten experiences. And they were also more positive around the fact that they felt that kindergarten does offer them more family support. So there are some questions here around how is it that, you know, families have these different experiences of the similar type of program. We dug a little deeper, invited them to participate in focus groups, and some did. And they, interestingly enough, were very capable about talking about early learning as a play-based approach. They used terms like emergent curriculum. And I said, are you an early childhood educator? And they're like, no, I'm not. I'm a fashion designer. I'm making that part up. But, you know, they weren't from early childhood, but they knew the language, right? And they did recognize that having fewer transitions reduced their family stress, and a couple of them even talked about the fact that it reduced their marital stress, because they no longer had to have a conversation about pick up and drop off and who's going to come midway to, you know, take Lorna over to the next program or take her over to home childcare. So they, you know, they were divided around whether or not kindergarten increased or their school involvement, and I think that that's a legitimate issue that the schools and the systems need to deal with. The educators, you know, had some interesting stories to tell. And this takes us into the idea where there are jobs in the community that are well paid and have good benefits, the transition over to the school jobs is not that significant in terms of wages. What is significant is in terms of benefits, access to things like pension plans, something we don't have very much of in the community or the private sector. What was interesting in Halton, there, because most of the ECEs were coming from the private sector, they saw a significant raise in their salary. And that speaks to the fact that we can know, you know, the Halton community is having a really hard time finding early childhood educators to work in their centers. You know, in my mind, I come to this work as a former early childhood educator and a center supervisor doing advocacy work. But what I see happening is that when a service is available through the school system, through the education system, that is a public system, that removes that market component, we are in a world where there's more access to kids, where there's more access to families, and where there are better jobs for the educators. So I come to this now as wondering about whether it's possible to expand the role of the schools to encompass more younger age children. And I know we worry about the schoolification of toddlers, right? But I wonder if that's something we need to have a conversation about. So, you know, the idea of nonprofit childcare and private childcare is, for me, not doing very much at all except keeping a lid on how far we can progress. Whereas I see a significant change in the way that kindergarten has, you know, rolled out. We have to pay attention to quality, I recognize that. But I think that if we're building a system, not just in Ontario, but across the country, I really do think that more and more we can work with the school system and the education system to make it a bit more accessible and more universal. Thank you.